Good afternoon to my faithful Beit Midrashers. Welcome to the Beit Midrash for today. Glad y'all are learning, glad y'all are reading, glad y'all are here. And for those watching after the fact on YouTube, thanks for watching. Thanks for tuning in this today. So we're not going to meet next week. I'll be out of town, and it's unlike a lot of people are going to be out of town. So we're skipping next week, but I thought it might be good to try to finish the book of Genesis today, as we will next Shabbat. It is kind of a nice feeling when you're ending the year and ending the book of Genesis at the same time. That's kind of a cool one. So we'll start Exodus in the first Shabbat of 2024 and the first Beit Midrash of 2024. So that's the plan for today. Is we're going to try to cover Parshiot Vayigash and Vayechi. Before I do, are there any lingering residual questions from last week?
Well, what we trying to figure out the significance, Barbara, of the number 7? That was one question. Why does 7 keep repeating itself in throughout the Torah?
So the short answer is the numbers 3, 7, and 10, and multiples thereof tend to be important numbers in the Tanakh generally. There's a little bit of dispute and question of why and why those particular numbers, but that's the general idea. There's one scholar, I can't remember who it is, who makes the argument that pretty much all the numbers you come into in the Bible, in the Tanakh, are either multiples of 3 or 3 plus 1. And again, they're not entirely, I don't think anybody's 100% sure why. But if you look at most of the big major numbers, 7 is 3 plus 3 plus 1. 10, 3 times 3 plus 1. 12 is 3 times 4, which itself is 3 times parentheses 3 plus 1. 72 is a multiple of 3. 70 is 7 and 10, which we already covered. So, I mean, they're pretty much all the numbers that keep popping up seem to fit into one of those two systems. Just, 3 you can kind of understand, is 3 is a number of stability. You have a table or a stool with 2 legs, it doesn't stand very well. 3, it'll stay. 7 seems to be and 10 seem to be symbolize like wholeness or completion. 7 has this connotation. 10 is kind of like a round number, so it just kind of signifies the first 10, and then everything else after that is from the first 10. So it's not a super satisfactory answer because nobody's entirely sure why they picked the numbers they picked, whether it had mathematical significance or whether it had spiritual significance, and what that spiritual significance was, if it was, or if they pulled it off of another ancient Near Eastern society that also valued those numbers. Nobody's 100% sure. But that's kind of
there is some bias in that explanation, in that if you take multiples of 3 and then multiples of 3 plus 1, you're leaving out 3 plus 2, but you're covering 2/3 of the numbers. So it's not like it might not be as special as we think it is.
Yeah. I mean, I think so. Here's kind of, I think there is something significant, and I do think the Tanakh picks the numbers. I don't think it's a random choice. I think they intentionally had some concept of why they picked the numbers they picked. But that's one of the criticisms of the 3 and 3 plus 1 is like, well, that's great, but that covers pretty much a lot of numbers. So It doesn't exactly, 4 doesn't come up all that often. That's 3 plus 1. It doesn't come up like 3 times 4 might come up, but 4 itself doesn't come up super often. Neither does 8. So I mean, why exactly the numbers that's one of the criticisms of that response, but it does seem to it fits the paradigm. It doesn't exactly explain the paradigm.
Okay.
Other questions? All right, so let's try to jump into Parshat Vayigash. The first psychotherapist, as Rabbi Sacks titles a chapter. Margaret is kind of laughing. Barbara is smirking. Stuart is now laughing, but I don't know if that's because Margaret and Barbara are.
Well, I just want to know
thoughts?
how many more jobs, how many more Parshas are going to give this guy another job, because he's an economist, he's a psychotherapist, and we go on to next week. So
Joseph was a pretty versatile guy. I mean, Renaissance man. Thoughts, comments, reactions to Rabbi Sacks's comments. Eddie has no thoughts or comments.
I thought it was a
Shaking his head.
stretch. I thought this was a real stretch to get to what he said. So comparing him to the 3 psychotherapists was a stretch, in my opinion. I mean, he did work on himself a lot, I guess, if you think about it. But other than that,
Yeah.
didn't think too much of this.
Any other response? I'll step back for a moment and let you guys respond, and then I'll chime in.
Well, I thought his comment that that Freud is generally considered to be the Jewish therapist, and pointing out that Freud considered things determined in a way that he picked. Who did he pick? Frankel, Beck,
Beck, and Seligman.
and Seligman.
Or Seligman.
Seligman, yeah, are see things as changeable. So I thought that was an interesting observation. Doesn't convince me that Joseph was the first psychotherapist, but it was yeah, interesting. Barbara, it's like you're about to say something.
I stuck on page 54, where Sacks says 2 different things. In the top part where he's quoting Genesis, he says, it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. It wasn't you that sent me here, meaning, by the being prisoner and sold off as a slave and everything, but God. Okay, work your way down to the bottom of the page. The top is saying God is the one who controlled his sale by his brothers, etc. And it says down to the bottom, second paragraph from the bottom, we aren't prisoners of events, but active shapers of them. You can't shape events and let God be in control of everything.
You're absolutely right, Barbara. But I think that the point that he's making has to do with his reframing of the situation. And so he doesn't necessarily have to say or believe himself, yeah, God made all of this stuff happen, but he reframes his situation in such a way as to make it such a way as to take the guilt off of his brothers.
You're right, Morgan. And yes, I thought of it that way, but I'm also trying to get into his head. And if he wants to make a literal interpretation, which I guess is my prejudice about Orthodox rabbis, which probably isn't, or any rabbi, Rabbi Henkin, they're going to take a very specific understanding. That's where I see the issue. In the long run, I personally believe that I'm an active shaper. And I love his little statement, whether I like how he got there or not. As Eddie says, stretch yourself, you can make it work. But we're not prisoners, we're active shapers. And look at all the things we do to actively shape things. And that's just the same old statement of when life gives you lemons, make lemon meringue pie. It's just shape it, do something differently, or as the wording was, reframe.
So I do want us to keep in mind, going back to kind of his introduction. What is Rabbi Sacks what is part of his argument for why he's writing this book?
I don't remember.
Jesus.
To simplify it so that we get something out of it.
No, it's called Judaism's life-changing ideas.
Yeah.
So what's he saying? His idea is that every parsha has an idea in it that can change our lives, but B, that previously, say before the Torah, might not have been so self-evident, but that we can learn it from the Torah. Excuse me. So this idea, I agree with you, Barbara. I'm not sure this is the most, I'm not sure this is an idea that he's sharing that none of us have heard before. It's not that, that we can't change what happens to us, but we can change how we react. Or if life gives you lemons, you make lemonade. Or how does he phrase it? We are not prisoners of events, but active shapers. I think all of us have heard this in some way, shape, or form previously. Part of his argument is, but it's in the Torah, and if it wasn't in the Torah, we might not have heard this. We might not have learned this.
Even more so than the Torah was the first one to actually present this.
I mean, I think that's almost feels a little chicken and egg, right? Like we learned it from the Torah because it's the first one to present it. If it hadn't presented it, would we have still learned it? The rabbis have kind of that concept with halakha of, excuse me, that there are laws that God commanded that if God hadn't commanded them in the Torah, we would have eventually figured them out. Like, you shouldn't kill other people, or you shouldn't steal from other people. If God hadn't commanded it, eventually humanity would have pieced that together logically. And I think that's a little bit, so I mean, you can make that same point here is, if God hadn't put Joseph into this, and if Joseph hadn't responded with, this was God's will and reframed his past together, would we have still learned that elsewhere? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe we are learning it because we're seeing it reflected in the Torah. Maybe we'd just now be coming up with that reality, thousands of years later.
Whenever I'm confronted with a difficult problem, I usually try to think of it in the extremes. And sometimes things become clear when you think of it in the extreme. So of these psychotherapists that are mentioned, Viktor Frankl's the only one that I've read, primary material from. And he wrote Man's Search for Meaning. He lived in an extreme, in Auschwitz, and in a very extreme situation. and all these. Even Joseph, as many troubles that Joseph had throughout his life, he didn't go to Auschwitz. I mean, he didn't get it that bad. He wasn't that horribly affected. So
Depends what the conditions in the Egyptian prisons were like, but yes.
yes. But anyway, I mean, the fact that Frankel basically got down to saying that when things get so bad, at least you know you have some control, and your control is how to decide how to respond to the situation. I thought that was meaningful. In the extreme, it helps you think about when worse comes to worse, you at least have some control over things.
I think I think I'm coming in the same place as Eddie is generally, where I feel like I really like the message. I agree with what he's saying and his thesis here. Why he picked these particular, he kind of cherry picked the psychotherapists, and can you actually argue Joseph was a psychotherapist? I don't think so. I have a little harder time with that. But I like where he comes out. I'm just not quite sure why. I think he could have gotten there any other number of ways. He didn't need to go that way. Because I suspect there are other psychotherapists, some of whom were Jewish, who probably came up with very different concepts of the mind that would completely disagree with this. So that was just kind of my takeaway from this. Is I agree with him 100% that we can't always control what happens, but we can control our reaction to what happens. That's a great life message. Pulling in all the psychotherapists to do that, good or bad, whatever. I think he could have gone there any number of ways. But
Well, oh, go ahead, Barbara. Sorry.
I was just going to say, but you still have to be living to control how you respond to it. If you get killed by the horrible thing that happens, and my reaction is some of the women hostages who've been treated very badly and then didn't survive, their families can choose how to respond, but those women can't.
well, yes.
You have to survive.
There's a condition there that I think, and a presumption that you can't react when you're dead. But yeah, so yes. Whether you want to argue that spiritually is a different question, but yes.
But you can react in the moments before you're dead.
Theoretically.
Short period, yeah.
Yeah, theoretically. I mean, some people are.
God forbid, I get shot in the head.
Yeah.
I don't really have anything to react to other than.
Right.
Does Judaism have a concept of martyrdom?
Yes.
It does.
Was there a follow-up to that? Or?
No, I'm trying to think of who did we think were the martyrs in Jewish history?
So yes, the classic example are the 10 rabbis who were killed by the Romans for teaching Torah. And each of them proclaimed their faith as they were dying, is essentially the short of it. But throughout history, martyrdom is usually characterized as giving up your life rather than publicly desecrating God's name.
It's not like you're going to get 70 Vestal virgins, right?
No. You're rewarded with like a special place in the world to come, but you don't get any kind of
You don't
enjoy paradise. That's about the extent.
But in Judaism, as I understand it, you don't go out to seek to be a martyr. You may You
Correct.
get to be put in a position where you choose to be a martyr, but you don't go out seeking it like the Vestal Virgin.
Exactly as Rabbi Sacks is arguing, right? Like you react to the situation that's in front of you and make the choice of not publicly desecrating God's name rather than refuting God. Sounds like we're more or less in general agreement on this commentary. Yes.
This where he draws, or is it in the next one where he draws the difference between, oh no, it's the next one. Oh, I'll wait, I'll hold my comment.
And we'll get there in a moment, I think, because I feel like we kind of hit this one where I think we're all in agreement that he could have gotten to this point any number of ways. He decided to do it this way. We can agree or disagree with the tenets, but we all agree with the conclusion, is kind of what I'm hearing in general.
Well,
But
yeah, but I can't think of another case where somebody has behaved the way that Joseph has. In his, I mean, calling him the first psychotherapist is perhaps a little cute, but is there another instance in which someone has behaved the way Joseph did towards people who have offended them?
I have to kind of sit back and think. David, I think, fills out more of the next chapter more than the Joseph.
Well, but I'm up to the point of Joseph.
Oh, up to the point of Joseph, and not really. And I think that's why he saves this lesson for Joseph, because Joseph is the first one who really says, yes, these terrible things happened to me, but God aimed it for a larger purpose. And that's, I think, why he could he have done it with Abraham? Sure. Abraham just doesn't have the same, doesn't teach it in the same way as Joseph does. Joseph's really the first one to kind of reframe his life events in a way that helps him deal with it.
And also for other people. I mean, it wasn't just reframing it or thinking about it for himself, but he's giving his brothers an opportunity to see things in a different way.
Right. Yes. Shall we go on to Parshat Vayechi?
Sure.
Yep.
Ready.
Comments, thoughts, reactions?
Well, now he's the first forgiver. I don't know if there's a job title for forgivers, but
Yeah.
it said the first forgiver as opposed to revenger.
So Joseph's a versatile guy, but it pays when you have kind of the longest continuous narrative in Genesis.
And the quickest death.
And the what?
Quickest death.
Yeah, he doesn't linger around very long.
So, Rabbi, let me ask you this. I mean, one of the messages they're trying to point out here is that the difference between a guilt culture and an honor and shame culture. And it's stated that the shame culture were typical of Greek and pre-Roman, pre-Christian Rome. So, but how did Christianity evolve? Is Christianity today a shame culture or a guilt culture? How does that sit?
I'm not the right person to ask on that because I am not part of a church. And I'm not a Christian theologian, though I do play one on TV. Sorry, thought we had to get that in there.
Can I interrupt and say something in response to Stuart? If you're
Sure, and
talking
then
about-
I'll respond. I'll actually respond to Stuart, but
Oh,
go ahead.
well, in thinking about shame culture, one of the things that you think of is Puritans in stocks, etc. One of the things that came to my mind. That's definitely shaming the people, putting them in stocks in the village square, etc. But they were Christians. So it definitely gives it, at least in their history, a shame culture.
Yeah, it seemed like it did to me. I don't know how they.
But maybe modern Christianity as opposed to 1600s Christianity.
Right.
So yeah, my perception of it after my disclaimer is yes, I do think it does have a shame culture to it. And I've seen that from a lot of people who come to me from Christian backgrounds and are like, I don't feel good in it. Right? Like I don't like being told how horrible I am because of my life. But you also think, you go to hell or you go to heaven. Yes, it is your behavior that determins it, but it's the individual who ends up making the trip, which what's going on? As he says, like on page 61, in guilt cultures, there's a fundamental distinction between the person and his or her acts. Or in shame cultures, wrongdoing is like a stain on the person. So if you think of, a lot of traditional Christian ideology, humanity is burdened with original sin, which means we are carrying with us a stain on us at all times. And we don't necessarily make a distinction between the person and their action, because the person, because of their actions, will be condemned or rewarded. That's kind of my, I don't want to speak for Christianity because I'm not Christian, but that's kind of my outsider's perspective on what he's saying.
And, well, the classic thing about Judaism is the guilt, especially with Jewish mothers, the guilt that they give on their children, right? So that's what I think of when I think of Judaism being a guilt culture. Am I wrong there?
The Catholics the Catholics are pretty good at it too. I think any Catholic will say, like, Jews and Catholics will argue about who gives their people more guilt. But
they get the shame and the guilt.
oh, there you go.
They get a double whammy.
Well, it is important. I'm just in interpersonal relations. I think it is important to separate the person from what they did, because then if you're going to forgive them, you don't agree with what they did, and you can forgive them for that, but it's not a permanent stain on that person or on your relationship with that person necessarily.
As I'm listening to this, I'm thinking about the mother of one of the hostages who was shot by the IDF, who was killed by the IDF, and who has said that the shooter should not feel guilty about it, and that she would like to meet them.
So, I'm curious what your response was at the bottom of 61, where he says, contemporary culture in the West, often thought by secularists to be morally superior to the ethics of the Hebrew Bible, is in fact, for good or bad, a regression to pre-Christian Greece and Rome. And that is why nowadays people who are found to have done wrong are publicly shamed.
Well, we certainly
I'm
see,
curious to your reactions to it.
yeah, well, we see a whole lot of that on social media for sure.
Well, he also says all the examples are common in the news. And that's because news sells better if there's something exciting and shameful and everything. It doesn't, it means that we're maybe becoming with that attitude, but without 24-hour news, would we be where we are today?
I don't think we would. We just know too much about everybody else. You know, we don't want to know all that stuff, but we hear it.
I think ultimately he makes a good point. If you go on to the next one, in a shame culture, try not to be found out.
Right. So, you know, the shame culture, I'm trying to see, you know, you cover up the stain and you hope you're not found. Whereas in a guilt culture, you try to make amends. Yeah, I guess that's a question. It's like, which one? He said thinks we're in a shame culture. You know, do you guys agree, disagree?
Well, I would like Margaret's opinion on this. You know, I think that children, when when they do something bad, their immediate reaction is, "I hope mommy and daddy don't find out about it," right? And then as you grow, hopefully you become more honest and open. But there still is a lingering thing, like you do something bad, oh my God, you know. But if you're mature and self-aware, I think that you can deal with it in an open fashion. Do you think that, Margaret, does that have validity?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Stuart. In fact, you know, I mean, sort of classically, in psychology, it's guilt is thought to be a more is the more mature, is more the more mature. And if you're, you know, working with someone, you would move them from shame towards guilt, and then ultimately toward tshuva, whether that's, you know, in a religious context or in some other way.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess part of the question, I guess the other part of the question is, do you agree with his distinction between a shame and a guilt culture?
I think it's perhaps drawing an artificial line that's too strict, as though, you know, everybody on this side is shamed all the time and everybody on that side is guilty all the time. But I think that I would agree that there is a difference with a kind of muddy, you know, sort of a muddy overlap.
It kind of reminds me of the heaven and hell discussion. I mean, one of the bad parts of that is it's binary. You're either going to hell or you're going to heaven. And how all your life balanced, and does one of it slightly tiptoe above so that you can go to heaven? But you know, you're still hopefully a good person, but you might, you know, it's easy to think about going to heaven or hell, but it'd be nice if there was something in the middle, right?
Way with purgatory.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, it does remind me of, all those things. There are two kinds of people in the world. Those who make lists and those who don't. Or There are two kinds of people in this world. There's all these like two kinds of people in this world. My favorite, by the way, just as a side note, my favorite is there are two kinds of people in this world. Those who can extrapolate from incomplete information.
That's it.
A good joke. If you ever need a really nerdy joke, that's a good one for you.
I get it.
You know, but yeah, like people, you know, humanity by definition, you know, just the way our brains are structured and the way our brains work is we need categories and distinctions. We need to be able, like, our brains can't comprehend everything. So we need to put things into boxes so that we can find the patterns and distinctions. But some of those distinctions are somewhat arbitrary. You know, Brene Brown does a lot on this difference between shame and guilt, which is fantastic. And I think she comes down in a similar type of place that as Rabbi Sacks, where, you know, guilt is fine. You want to feel guilty. Like, feeling guilty is not a bad thing because it helps you learn and change. Shame, you get defensive and you put on your armor and you try to fight your way through. But you don't necessarily look back and learn something from it. You're just trying to avoid shame. So I mean, I do hear the, you know, it is somewhat of an arbitrary distinction, you know. Is there guilt in a shame society? Is there shame in a guilt society, in a righteousness and guilt society? You know, I don't think it's quite as clear cut as he kind of tries to make it out to be. Yeah, Barbara?
One of the things that strikes me as different between shame and guilt is that one you put on yourself and shame is imposed on you. I feel guilty versus shame on you. Of course,
I think that's a good distinction, personally.
it may not answer all situations, but
Well, what I'd like to ask the rabbi about Yom Kippur.
I'm still struggling with Barbara's. I'm thinking about it.
okay.
Go ahead, Stuart.
Well, I don't want to interrupt you, but
No, it's going to take me a minute to kind of think through that.
Process,
So
process.
go ahead.
no, I was just thinking on Yom Kippur, that's, I think, the ultimate time in the year of a Jewish person where you're asking for forgiveness. And I was just trying to think back for, you know, like the Al-Khair. I think those are, I don't think those are shameful requests to be forgiven for the things in the Al-Khair. I'd like your opinion about it, but that's the ultimate time where you confront yourself with God and you are trying to decide, you know, whether people knew it or not, what sort of things did you do during the year that were sinful and you're asking for forgiveness? I mean, does that ring a bell correctly, Rabbi?
No, look, there is a lot about the Al-Khair that, yes, you're asking for forgiveness. And, you know, it's one of the things I say every year is, you know, why do we do it in the plural? So that, you know, I might not have done it. So why am I including myself? It's because there's two typical reasons that I've usually heard. One is somebody in this congregation probably has. And so that we don't out them and shame them for doing it, and we give them the opportunity to do tshuva without humiliating them, then, you know, we include as if all of us had. The other is, you know, and I think, you know, in some ways I kind of like this one better. I may not have been guilty, but I didn't stop it from happening either. So I may, intentionally or not, have enabled an environment that allowed these crimes to be committed, transgressions to be committed. Going back to Barbara's statement, I'm still struggling a little bit, and I think, you know, Stuart's question flies in a little bit too. I do think there's a level where we put the shame on ourselves, or we, you know, perceive shame even if it wasn't there. So taking some of the ones from the Al-Khait, for example. You know, if we were to tell someone, or we were to openly admit that, you know, we had done some of those really serious transgressions, we had an affair with somebody.
He froze.
Which is why we don't openly talk about it, right? Because we're afraid what other people are going to say. So in that sense, we're shaming ourselves. And I think this is part of Brene Brown's, why Brene Brown is so popular as well, because that's part of, is like, the shame isn't always evident. It's we're putting the shame on ourselves before it even happens. And that we need to, the part of her argument is you need to go out there and release the shame, because otherwise it just kind of builds and builds and builds inside of you. But that if you let it out and bring it into the open, then the shame kind of dissipates. I do think there's a level at which we impose shame on ourselves, and I do think there's a level at which we impose guilt on each other. And in some way, that's a way of, to some extent, it's a way of education too, of that's not okay, and you should feel bad about it. Right? Like, other people do impose guilt also. I don't have the book with me. If you read, Brene Brown has a book, I want to say it's like The Heart of Imperfection or something like that. I'll see if I can find it quickly. But she makes a distinction between guilt and shame, which I think is a very useful way to think of it. The Gifts of Imperfection, that's what it's called. That was kind of her first big book where she really distinguishes between, you know, living a life of shame and defining shame and guilt and all that. I'm a big Brene Brown fan, so I'm somewhat biased. But she does make some distinctions between guilt and shame, which I think play a role in, you know, what Rabbi Sacks is saying as well. I'm not convinced, you know, I think he makes a very neat distinguishing argument. And I think I agree with him that we want to have a culture of grace and hope, and we want to be able to forgive each other, and we want to create an environment where we feel like we can forgive each other, and that people can grow and change and be better when they make mistakes. And we want to nurture that kind of culture and society, which we are currently not living in. I agree with all that. I think the problem, kind of what we were saying before, is I think when you break it down into arbitrary designations, the designations are never quite as clean as he tries to make them out to be.
This is totally obvious, but I don't think it's been explicitly said before in, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong in this discussion, but you know, shame is so much about what other people think. And so, and I guess that is his distinction between inner directed and other directed, come to think of it. But it's
Yeah.
so much about what other people think, and guilt is more about your own perception of.
Well, that's kind of what Barbara was saying too. I think where I'm struggling with that is, I think shame comes from what we think other people will think. Not necessarily what other people are thinking, but what we think other people are going to say if they were to find out. And guilt, yes, it's what we feel bad about what we did, but there are times we make other people feel guilty. And we kind of force those feelings onto other people. Because sometimes it's educational, sometimes we're just being mean. I don't know. You guys can disagree with me if you think I'm wrong. That's fine too. But
Well, unless you're talking about children, I don't know that you can make an adult feel guilty unless they're willing to accept the guilt.
no,
Children,
I mean, look, I think that's why a lot of people struggle with Yom Kippur. So, it just makes me feel bad, right? Like, it's depressing. It makes me feel bad. It doesn't feel uplifting. It just makes me feel guilty. Now, they might have guilt in the first place, and this is just bringing up those feelings of guilt. But I do think there are circumstances in which we can. I'll give you an example. Somebody recently did something. I won't go into the details because I don't want to out anybody. They did something that angered a lot of people. They didn't mean to do it. They thought they were doing the right thing. They thought they were being supportive. And then finding out people were angry at them, I had to sit down with them and say, this is why people are angry. And they said, oh my God, I didn't realize it. I feel so horrible. Is that shame or guilt? Probably, in this case, there's probably a little bit of both. But I think, I think as an adult, you can say, oh my God, I didn't realize I was having that effect. I feel guilty about causing that pain to happen. Right?
So, Rabbi, let me ask you this Yom Kippur related question. So if you get to be really good at forgiveness, so all year long,
your Joseph level forgiveness.
all year long, the little things, the big things that you do that are hurtful to other people, all the things that the Al Hate is asking. If you do this on a daily basis all throughout the year, now you get to Yom Kippur, should you feel like your soul is clean? And specifically this person you were talking about, they didn't even know. I mean, if people hadn't told them, they wouldn't have known that that was hurtful, and they would have gotten to Yom Kippur and wouldn't have even asked for forgiveness. So how does that get reconciled in God's book of life?
Well, this is why we have tshuva, right? So look, there's a couple things. One is Rabbi Eliezer, the famous Rabbi Eliezer, where his students ask him for advice on how to live a good life. And one of the things he says is you should do tshuva one day before you die. What's the obvious question?
When are you going to die?
Nobody knows when they're going to die.
but every day.
What's his response? You do tshuva every day and you'll live a life of repentance throughout your life. That's the situation you're describing. So if you're a Rabbi Eliezer and a Joseph person, yes, there should come a point where you get to Yom Kippur and you feel like, yes, I feel like everything has been, the world is kind of back on track spiritually. At least my world is back on track spiritually. But there's still a level at which, one of my favorite paragraphs in Yom Kippur is right after the Al Chait, where it says, there's a line in there. It says, for these transgressions and for these transgressions, for the ones that I've named and the ones that I have not named, for the ones that are known to you, I've already confessed, and for the ones I don't know, you already know about them. You being God. Which there's always that level of which we do our best, but we might cause pain where we don't know about it. And we ask God for forgiveness for those too. Like, even if you're a Rabbi Eliezer, Joseph level forgiver, there's still a level at which you're like, I may have done things that I don't even know about. And so, God, please forgive me for those too, because I don't even know I committed those. So, if I hadn't sat down with this person to say, these are all the reasons why people are upset with you, and this is what you need to do tshuva, and I sat down with this person and said, because they said, what do I do? I'm like, you do tshuva. So first thing you do is you send them a message and say, I realize, I thought I was doing a good thing. I apologize that I realize now why it caused pain. I am very sorry for that. It won't happen again. And, please forgive me. And now then you go out and you meet with them and you sit down with them and you try to talk with them and say, I hear you. I understand why. I'm sorry. And you try to build that relationship again. And I said, and don't do it again. I mean, that's what you have to do. To my knowledge, they haven't done it again. But that's all we can really do, right? Is, if I hadn't sat down with them, they would have never known. They would have still been thinking they did the right thing. Did that actually answer your question, I think?
Yes.
Okay.
I feel like we're getting a Yom Kippur sermon right here.
I'll say, I gave this sermon at one point. I don't remember if I talked to you guys about it. Did any of you watch The Good Place? One of my favorite shows, if you haven't watched it, it was on Netflix for a while. I don't know. I'm sure that you can watch it somewhere. I won't give away the whole issue, but the general overall concept of it is that there's a good place and a bad place. They don't call it heaven and hell. They call it the good place and the bad place. And, essentially every action you do on this planet earns you points, either positive points or negative points. And every action has a point designation. And if you earn enough points, then you make it to the good place. You don't earn enough points, you make it to the bad place. But there's a scene in the show where they say, what about buying a tomato? They say, I go to the grocery store, I'm hungry, I decide I'm going to make the healthy choice and buy a tomato. And I'm going to use that because that's healthy. I don't know when I buy the tomato that it wasn't harvested by abused immigrants, and that they're underpaying the immigrants, and that they're using pesticides that are destroying the planet, and that the grocery store owner is not abusing his employees, and that he's not price gouging me. He's like, I have no way of knowing those things. So, I'm doing something that I think should be earning me positive points, but in fact, it might be earning me a whole lot of negative points because I have no idea that it's earning me negative points.
That's a dilemma.
That's the challenge in living life, right? Is that, we make the best decisions we can with the available information we have. We try our best. We have the best of intentions. And when we don't live up to them, We
Feel
apologize.
too
We try to do
feel
tshuva.
too guilty about that.
You should feel guilty, a little guilty that you thought you did the right thing and you did it. That's fine. But
Yeah.
you should grow from it and learn from it and try to make better decisions the next time. And that's what Yom Kippur is really about, is saying, I tried my best to live up to the expectations God has for me. I inevitably, because I am an imperfect person living in an imperfect world, I didn't always do that. So forgive me for those times when I didn't. Yes.
I have a question about forgiveness. It seems to me that there are laws, I'm calling them laws about forgiveness. I assume they're rabbinical, not written down somewhere, but I need Stuart to forgive me for, giving him a flat tire because he ran over a roofing nail in my house or something like that. I can't do that. I had nothing to do with the roofing nail. It was my house. So I can't be forgiven, or I can't ask you, Stuart can't ask me to forgive him for something I really didn't do. That can only come from the person responsible. Or if he asked me 3 times, I still have to forgive him. I mean, aren't there those kind of rules, and are they rabbinical, or is it grandma?
Or is it what?
There's a whole lot of discussion in the Daf Yomi right now about these. I mean, I read the light version, so I don't know.
Oh.
Yeah, as the nail is probably not the best example because that brings up a whole bunch of liability questions.
Well, I had to, okay, I'm not
But,
getting legal about it.
the example I usually give is, if I were to punch you in the face and break your jaw, you and I got into a heated argument. We got really angry at each other, and I just lost my temper and punched you in the jaw and broke your jaw. So that's a kind of a simple case. So, let's take the simple case. First step, I come to you in the hospital and say, I admit I was wrong. I know we got heated. I shouldn't have lost my temper to that extent. I should have taken a breath and stepped away. So that's step one. I admit I did something wrong. I know I did it. Not an accident, by the way, that the first step of every 12-step program is to admit that you have a problem. Because if you don't admit it, then it's like it doesn't really exist. You have to verbally say, I admit I punching you in the face was the wrong thing to do. Step 2, you apologize. I lost my temper. I apologize. I shouldn't have done that. I admit that was wrong. I'm very sorry about that. I wish I hadn't done it. I feel horrible. I'm sorry. Step 3 is, if possible, you make financial restitution. I feel bad. I'm sorry. Let me pay for your medical bills for breaking your jaw. And then step 4 is you're in the same situation and you don't do it again. In which case, maybe 5 years later, you're completely healed. We get into another heated argument about something else. And you know what? I'm going to step back. I need to take a couple breaths. I'm getting too upset. Let's talk about this another time. Don't punch you in the face. Those are the steps of tshuva. The nail in the roofing nail in the driveway is a little more difficult because it is your driveway. You probably have some liability towards ensuring that the roofers didn't leave any nails there before Stuart came over with his car. So you might have some liability there and say, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that was there. I feel bad. Let me pay for your tire. I'm going to go around and make sure they got all the other nails. I'm going to go around with a magnet and make sure they got all the nails there. Does that answer your question?
Not directly, but maybe I'll look, maybe I'll look on Daf Yomi and be able to figure out some of these other ones.
I mean, exactly these kinds of questions are.
But Rabbi, what you've described is a combination of appeasement, which is the, let me give you some restitution for it. Which I like how Rabbi Sacks says early on in this chapter, that that's a biological impulse for appeasement. And, if Stuart feels better because I pay for his tire, all right.
Well, no. So I think that's part of the point of tshuva, is that yes, there is a appeasement aspect to it.
Yeah.
But there's a spiritual aspect to it as well, of trying to work towards forgiveness and to try to heal the breach in the relationship that may have been caused by the action. The physical appeasement is a part of that. If I apologize but don't offer to make restitution, how sincere are you actually going to think my apology is? Right? You're still stuck with thousands of dollars of medical bills because of my actions. Are you going to think I really meant it? That's one of the issues I think we have on social media right now also, is, people dig up things from 15 years ago. This is the one that drives me nuts. People said this 15 years ago. You posted this anti-LGBTQ statement. I'm not the same person I was 15 years ago. That doesn't mean it accurately reflects who I am today, but that's beside the point. But even if I said something last week, they say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize how hurtful that would be." I don't actually believe that. How sincere is that apology, and how much is it, how much of it is really actually guilt, and how much of it is, shoot, I've been caught and called out, I need to say something to restore my image. And that's when you offend a group of people, that's one of the more challenging parts of it, is you can't apologize to all millions of people that you may have offended, but how do you make adequate apologies and repair the relationship? I think there are celebrities and people who do it well and have done it well. I'd say they're probably in the minority, but that's just my perception too. Other ponderings, thoughts?
I'll see y'all in 2 weeks.
Yes, no class next week. So wishing everybody a wonderful and happy new year. Wishing, as I like to say, I hope 2024 is at least as good as 2023. But because if 2023 was awful, then it's at least 2024 will at least be a little bit better. Hopefully significantly, and if 2023 was a good year for you generally, then hopefully 2024 will be even better. But any last comments, thoughts before we sign off?
You just gave us homework. Work on ourselves.
Your homework is to do tshuva one day before you die. And to grow a little bit more each day. So
Thank you, Rabbi.
Happy New Year, everybody, and see y'all next year. Take care.
Margaret, send me the thing about Daf Yomi. So the Daf Yomi, so I can get in on the reading.
Yeah, it's on